months, as we roll out the platform, the virtual food bank tonnage will far exceed the tonnage we receive from retailers, wholesalers, and manufacturers' distribution centers. Next steps are to scale across the country and add partners from other sectors and also add further development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Very important issue there that I think doesn't just affect South Africa, but even in other parts of the world too. So our final talk today is from Susan. So over to you.
Thank you very much and good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, my talk is about food waste, and I must perhaps point out to you that I'm a researcher in waste management, and therefore my talk will focus a bit more on the waste side of things. And basically our interest in food waste was triggered when we did waste characterization studies in big cities here in South Africa. And the results showed that about 17% of municipal solid waste coming from households is actually food. And to me that was quite shocking, keeping in mind that we have people in South Africa also going hungry, not having enough food to eat. And if you look on the right of the slide, the composition of the food waste is typically about 44% fruit and vegetables, 26% cereals, 15% meat and dairy, and 13% roots and tubers. Just to show you what it looks like when we do a waste characterization study and we open up bags coming from households, you see food that looks still perfectly fine, especially if you look at that cauliflower. It's still in the packaging. It still looks quite edible. The only thing is it's past the sell-by date, not even the use-by date. We also found that some condemned food arrives at the landfill, and I was quite shocked when a whole bucky load of Viennas arrived at the landfill when we were busy there. So you can see the food going to waste is quite shocking. So then just to put things in perspective, we've just heard about food surplus. So we don't consider food surplus as waste. We consider food waste as everything that is meant and produced to be consumed by humans that actually ends up as waste and not being eaten by humans. And we distinguish between avoidable and unavoidable food waste. The unavoidable food waste is typically the pips and the peels and the shells that you get when you prepare food, whereas the avoidable food waste is that is perfectly fine for consumption, but somewhere in the process, something happens that it's no longer consumable. For instance, if you burn food while preparing it, offcuts that you don't eat, those will be the things that are this picture comes in. When we define food waste, it is the food that is produced for human consumption but not eaten, and it can be composed of raw or cooked materials and includes waste before, during, and after meal preparation in the household, as well as the losses during the processing as well as on farm. So in the end, all food that was produced for human consumption that is not eaten becomes waste, and it ends, or it happens all along the food supply chain, right from the start. When we look at statistics, now it's important to look at statistics if you want to quantify food waste. And we've heard that it's very difficult to quantify food waste, but we have to do that if we want to measure our progress against meeting the targets of the SDGs. So if we want to measure if we actually attain a 50% reduction in food waste, we have to know how much food waste we actually generate. Now, if you look at the FAO food balance sheets, it already gives us some indication in that it shows us, and I don't know what happened to this slide, but the percentage of food is actually only 69% of all the foodstuffs that is produced. And then there is a certain portion that is indicated as losses on the food balance sheets, which relates to losses during storage and transportation. If we then look at the different commodities, then you will see the numbers in black indicates the percentage of the specific commodity that is actually targeted for food. There's also a percentage that goes for processing, and then the feed proportion is there as well as those for seeds to ensure that we have a harvest next year. And then the losses is the dark blue bits. So if we then look at the South African situation, in 2013 we did our first attempts at quantifying food waste in South Africa. You will see right on the left, it's 31.1 million tons of foodstuff that was produced. We imported some 6.4 million tons, but along the supply chain we had losses, and those are the losses indicated in the blue circle at the bottom. And they add up to about 30% of all that was produced locally in South Africa. In total, it's about 10 million tons of food that ends up as waste in South Africa. Now the question is, what is wasted? If we apportion that data to the different commodity groups, you can see that fruit and veg right in the middle stands out. Those are the more perishable foodstuffs and therefore more likely to be wasted. Cereals, being our staples, are the second highest waste product in the whole list, and then followed by roots and tubers and the meat and the others. So therefore, what is important to note here as well is that it seems like the majority of the fruit and vegetables wasted is during processing and packaging, and that may be as a result of small blemishes that results in the food being not packed, or even during our processing, it will be the pips and the peels and all the offcuts, and then all the non-perfect food that doesn't fit the machines that do the processing, that in the end does not get processed but ends up as waste. So we then continued our research to try and understand why food is wasted and how much of food is wasted. And the case study that we've done in the city of Tshwane, that is Pretoria, we asked the respondents to give us an indication of how much of what they buy actually goes to waste. And you will see there, fruit and vegetables is top of the list. 53% of our respondents indicated that they throw away more than 20% of what they buy. And of those, about 31% said more than 30%. And if you then go down the list, cereals was second, dairy products third on the list, and so it goes. So why do people waste? We asked this question. We did not prompt them. We asked them an open-ended question to see what response we get. And a staggering 56.7% of our respondents actually said because the sell-by date indicated that the product has expired. Now, in my mind, sell-by, expiry, it's not the same thing. Sell-by means it's no longer allowed on the shelf in the store, but it's still perfectly good for consumption. Expiry date is the use-by date. So people are confused. The second most mentioned reason was we are concerned about the health and safety of my family using the product. The third one, we prepare too much. And the fourth one, it appears unappetizing. So we can see it's not that it's not good for consumption, it's a perception that it's not good for consumption that results in a lot of food wastage at household level. The question is then always asked, but do poor people also waste food? And the answer is yes. And our results actually show that there's not a significant difference between the amounts of food wasted by poor households as compared to higher income households. And quite interesting, the reasons why people waste food in South Africa, in the Tshwane case study done by a student of mine, actually showed that cooking too much is one cross-cutting reason. Now that is typical of the South African culture, no matter from which cultural background you come, but we always prepare food for the unexpected visitor. And if the unexpected visitor don't arrive, We think we are very good and we store the food to eat later. But unfortunately, a lot of us forget about the food stored in the fridge to eat later, or we just don't like to consume food after it's been stored for a day or two. So yes, that is, to me, quite interesting. But South African food are not only consumed locally, we are feeding an export market. South Africa is currently a net exporter of food. And you can see from this graph that in 2015, the destinations of fresh fruit was mostly the United Kingdom. We exported 29% of our fruit, of our exports was fruit to the UK, and there I've got the indication that 25% of food purchased by UK consumers actually ends up as waste. The second one is Europe, the European Union, 28.5%, and again, Dutch homes waste 8 to 11% of food that they purchase. Now, apart from that, the food that reaches the end market ends up being wasted in households. We must also keep in mind that the export market for the fresh produce is mostly by sea. So we upload our fresh produce that's produced here onto a ship. It takes about 3 weeks for the ship to reach the UK or other places in Europe. And during that whole process, the cold chain must be maintained, pests must be controlled, and we must ensure that the quality of the products that end up in the market is good. And there already in the ports, you may get some wastage again. If we look at the vegetables, we are also exporting some vegetables, mostly to the African market. And how do we export to the African market? Mostly by rail. And this picture was taken at the border post between Botswana and Zambia 2 years ago. There's no bridge to cross the river, and the only means to cross that river at that point in time was a pontoon, and it was out of service already for 2 weeks. So the line of trucks that we saw waiting to cross the border was kilometers long. So you can imagine that exporting into Africa is also no easy task. And as a result of the conditions, we also end up with a lot of wastage, and we don't know exactly how much. So in conclusion then, from a waste management perspective, I show you the food waste hierarchy. First of all, we want to reduce food waste. We don't want to produce food that is not eaten by humans, so we must be more smart about how we deal with our food. If it's not eaten by the people that buys it, then certainly we can find other people in need and direct the food to the worthy, as is done by Food Forward, and we are very glad to see the good work that they are doing. If we can't feed humans with the food, then at least let's feed the animals, so that we don't have to produce more food to feed the animals or more feed to feed the animals, because we know we've got limited capacity from our agricultural production. And then we have the options, if it is wasted, to either generate electricity through anaerobic digestion or to simply compost the food so that, again, it can go back into the agricultural land to ensure that we have good harvests for future. So what is, in conclusion then, my remarks? South Africa produces enough food to feed everybody. However, we still have people that don't have enough to eat on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are wasting in the order of 10 million tons of perfectly good food every year. If we contribute to global food supply chain, we reduce the shelf life and add losses into the system, and in the process deprive people of food that could be used to feed them. Also, food reduction will contribute to global food security. And in my mind, this is very important. We cannot continue to produce more food and continue wasting the food that we produce because we are doing an injustice. We have to ensure that the food that we produce actually reach the human stomach. And then, just as a closing remark, we are currently busy updating our numbers for South Africa. We are updating our assumptions because most of our estimates are based on assumptions to make sure that we get to more accurate numbers, and we hope that in the near future we will be able to publish more accurate estimates of how much food we waste in South Africa. And hopefully that will be a wake-up call to be more effective in our food systems. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to our three speakers, and I agree with the last comments. We can't really allow this to go on. We seem to be totally focused on producing more, but we have to look at the other side of the coin, which is to reduce food losses and waste, and give that as much prominence as producing more. Okay, so we've got time for a number of questions now. So if you'd like to ask a question, then please go to one of the mics on the side. Whilst you're thinking about that, I'm going to take sort of chairman's privilege and ask the first one, and this is to all of the panelists. Do you think we can achieve Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, which is halving food waste? And if we can't do it now, I'm not trying to preempt the question, what do we need to do? Who would like to go first? Serge?
I'm not sure. Is it working?
Yeah.
Is this working?
Yes.
I'm not sure if... Is your question about strictly food waste?
It's around food losses and waste.
Food losses and waste. Well, it depends on the definition you give to food losses and waste, but presumably, one of the key elements that's behind the issue of reducing crop losses is minimizing the impacts of agriculture on the environment. And that is because the crop losses correspond to commensurate losses in water, energy, labor, skills, seeds, which are lost. So the idea is in reducing crop losses is not necessarily to produce more, it's to produce more efficiently. And that's a central element, I think. And then when it comes to reducing those losses by half, then I think that, yes, there is prospect to achieve that. And the duration of time which is imposed by the goals is a challenge, but in many cases, technologies are available to sustainably reduce losses very significantly, at least in many field crops. In the case of different, because the context is that of very many diverse crops which play a central role in the diets, but they are very different and which are exposed to very, very different patterns and types of pests and diseases. And so it's a long way still to reduce that.
Okay, thank you. Susan, do you want to answer that?
From my perspective, I certainly think it's possible to reduce the food waste and losses in the supply chain post-farm. That shouldn't be too difficult in theory. In practice, however, we have to change people's behavior. And I think all of us know that changing people's behavior is not that easy. So yes, in theory it's possible. In practice, I think it's going to be a bit more challenging. And therefore, I think we need a lot more awareness around food waste and the injustice as a result.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
The fast-moving consumer goods industry in South Africa is worth over 700 billion rand annually. And that's a huge animal to be able to turn around. And while we we are partnering with a number of larger stakeholders and major wholesalers, retailers, and manufacturers. I think the starting point must be relevant and up-to-date research. We need to know what the extent of the problem is. We need to know how much is being dumped in landfill, and we need to know the minutiae of that detail. How much of it is food, how much of it is non-food groceries, and what the reasons for that are. I think there's just too little research and too little data. Informed decisions around solutions until we get to the crux of the problem and we know exactly what the problem is and the scale of the problem.
Okay, thank you. So can we have a question from the lady over there, please? Can you just say who you are and where you're from? Thanks.
Hello, I'm Ollie van Hal from the Wageningen University Animal Production Systems Group. First of all, thank you for your very inspiring talks, but in the context that we're now talking on a global food security conference, talking about the role of food losses and waste in the global food production systems, aren't we then omitting one big source of food losses, that is basically the fact that there are many people overeating? Should we consider that as a food loss? There is basically food that could be in a bin, or whether you throw it in your throat while you don't need it.
Okay, great question. Who wants to field that then?
I'm willing to take a bash at that. In my research, I have read a number of reports where it's actually considered a waste if you are overeating. I think in a country like South Africa, we are on the same trend. We see more obesity happening as we more westernize our diets. And therefore, I think the awareness needs to be raised now and not any later, because we don't want to end up wasting valuable nutrients and by overeating.
Andy?
Yeah, I think while the question is a valid one, when you look at the context and by comparison, when you look at the number of people that are suffering from malnutrition and dying from malnutrition, and you look at the malnutrition-related diseases, and you look at the fact that most of the food waste happens on the pre-consumer food side, although, as my colleague Susan indicated, there's a concerning and growing problem on the household side. I think we sit with a bigger problem of people that are food insecure on a daily basis, comparative to the obesity problem on the scale. And I think, certainly from our perspective, I think the problem of people that don't have the resources to secure enough food on a daily basis. That's a huge problem in our country, in South Africa at least.
I mean, perhaps if I can answer the question, and whilst I'm answering the question, I'm actually sucking my stomach in. I think if we looked at the overall true cost of food, I think that might give us a better means of judging this issue. So we don't really bring in the cost of type 2 diabetes. We don't bring in the cost of heart disease, premature death,